clean and affordable energy and transport for citizens. And of course, to the third and last day of the Research and Innovation Days. As you know, it's a really big thing for us at DG Research Innovation at the European Commission. The first time really that we organize an event of this magnitude, and we're very happy with it, and we're very happy that you made it to this panel today. Now, the topic, of course, touches on two important things, one being citizen engagement and societal outreach, and the other one being the integration of social sciences and humanities into the research support that we provide in these areas. And you'll hear a lot more about these things from our panel. I do hope that we're all going to be inspired by what we're going to hear, and I hope that you will have something to contribute. You will ask questions later on. You'll have a chance to do that. And without further ado, let me hand over to our moderator, Helen Spence-Jackson from EIT Climate Kick. And she will take you through the proceedings, introduce the speakers, and make sure that everybody stays on time and has a chance to come in and contribute. So over to you, Helen.
Thank you very much, and indeed welcome to everybody, and not least to the panelists. So I'm joined on the stage here by Chris Folds from Anglia Ruskin University, and going across the line here is Robert Braun from the Institute for Advanced Studies in Vienna, Mariana Rokok from Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and finally Imre Kezeru from the VUB. And as Gerd said, I'm from the European Institute of Innovation and Technology, Climate Kick. And if that's already conjuring a picture of technological solutions to some of these problems, let me just immediately say, if any of you have met my CEO in the last few days, you'll be very aware that we consider innovation to span a whole range of areas, and not purely around technological solutions, but also around behavioural change, policy change, financial systems change, and business model change, and of course also in terms of governance, which links us very neatly to today's panel, where we are going to be focusing both in terms of decarbonisation, mobility and energy systems, being not just about technology, but also about citizens' engagement and generating a shared vision of a future in research and innovation priorities that can really be engaging around energy and mobility challenges. So without any further ado, what I've asked the speakers to do in the very first round here of questions is to ask them all actually the same question, which I'd like them to answer from their different perspectives, and at the same time using that as a way of introducing themselves further, so you get a feel for what their particular areas of expertise are. We'll then have a second round of separate questions to the speakers, and then given that the main aim of this session as well is around citizen engagement, I really want to make sure that we have time for an interactive discussion with you from the audience as well, before we move to conclusions. So without any further ado to my panelists here, kick-off question to all of you. Feels like a bit like exam time here. So in no more than 3 minutes, how have citizens been engaged in the last 10 years in your specific field of expertise? Starting with you, Chris. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, I can hear the microphone kicking in. I'm a principal research fellow based at Anglia Ruskin in Cambridge, and the main perspective that I'm going to bring to this is to do with our coordination of the Energy Shift project, which builds upon some work we did on a previous Horizon 2020 project called Shape Energy. Really, we're interested in energy SSH, so energy research from social sciences and humanities, and trying to see, well, how can that be integrated within policymaking, and in particular within the societal challenges, the energy work programme of Horizon Europe and, of course, Horizon 2020. So from that perspective, and bear in mind, I think something's on the screen at the moment, sort of showing at least some of the broad areas that we're working in. And so taking it from, oh, I'm trying to click. Great. Taking it from that sort of rough set of boundaries, and then also drawing on some of the Commission's own work in terms of monitoring the quality of this integration, and all of the funding calls that have been looking at citizens' engagement. I probably will just point to 5 short points that I'd like to make to begin the session. Firstly, I think that there's been sometimes too much of an overemphasis, sometimes perhaps even an obsession with deficits. So there's not enough of the right thing, and there's been a lot of work around, technologies and information, but that's now sort of gone on to not the right technology, not the right intervention, or not the right attitude, or the worldview or value, whatever it may be. And it's always sort of puts a slightly simpler view of how we should engage with citizens. We've sort of reduced the problem down, really. And I think it's also can produce some unrealistic expectations of how we then engage with citizens. Number two, I think citizens are really rarely engaged in actually setting the problem definition. So this isn't step one, this is almost step zero. I mean, how often do proposals, so even before you get to the projects, actually in the proposal writing, involve the citizens at that stage? I think also, point three, that there is sometimes too much of a focus on social acceptance, whereby then how we engage citizens is quite passive and often predetermined, because maybe there's a technological vision which then we need to try and sort of convince and get the public to accept. Number four, I mean, this panel is all about citizens, and not that I'm saying, you know, we're not living in a democratic society, but to me, ideas of citizens is not coming out through how energy research innovation is funded. So it's perhaps more to do with notions of consumers and users, whereas citizens is, you know, putting the citizen at the heart of the decision-making process. It's active, not passive. It's not tokenistic consultation, it's full participation, it's looking at issues of justice and fairness, and not just something that happens at the end of the decision-making system. And then finally, bearing in mind that I suppose my interest is in social science and humanities, integration within these work programs, and drawing on the commission reports that are there, I'll just point to the fact that I think that, well, it's been shown that a lot of the funded research innovation in what's called the flagged SSH projects, so the commission of flagged projects that they see as really important, it's been shown that say up to often around 30% of those projects have zero SSH partners, so no expertise working on projects that are deemed to be important, which have citizen engagement at their heart. And I think that needs to perhaps change moving forward.
Thank you very much. Moving straight on to you, Robert.
Thank you very much. So I come from Vienna, Institute for Advanced Studies. I'm the deputy head of a group called Technoscience and Social Transformation. So we work at the confluence of technology and society. My specific area of expertise is mobility, within that automobility and the transition to from driven to autonomous mobility. And I'm very sad to hear actually what Chris said, because I was thinking that it's only mobility, it's only about cars that is so dim a picture, but apparently energy is no different. So I want to be very bold here, because that's what we were asked. I've been here for 2.5 days, and there's a lot of talk about public engagement and citizen involvement, but as in the past, I don't see this happening in the future of research and innovation, and that's kind of sad. And the main goal, it seems to me, that Europe is trying to fight enemies, self-defined enemies of the US and China in catching up in research and innovation, instead of trying to develop its own game. And the European game should be much more about democracy, equity, and sustainability. And let me show you a few slides of our flagship research program, which is the biggest SWOFS program ever given. And it's about looking at Horizon 2020 from a research and responsible research and innovation perspective. And if you look at this slide, this is an RI awareness map of the whole thing, and this is core research in looking at policy documents, interviewing researchers, and looking at projects in Cordis. And as you see from the heat map, there's a lot of talk in the policy documents, and then as we get to what's called policy integration, RI just phases out. They're not represented in the projects, actually, that are not in the SWOFS territory, but elsewhere. And when you look, this is the heat map of the whole of Horizon 2020, same thing. And then when you look at transport, which is one of the program lines, and when you look at one specific key, public engagement, and that's kind of the zooming in picture on your right, what you see again is that in the policy documents, public engagement is kind of there, at least talked about. And then when you talk to researchers, the awareness just fades away. And then when you look at projects, it's not there. And the reason why it's not there is that because it's not integrated on a policy level. And what does it mean to integrate on a policy level? And this is the recommendations actually we do make for the Commission. One, that it does need to have in the sheets that have to be submitted, in the forms that have to be submitted, there needs to be some questions, not tick box exercises, about reflection on these questions.
Okay, we'll come back to recommendations a little later. Moving on to Marianne, and a reminder of the exam question. So in your perspective, from the area of your expertise, how have citizens been engaged in the last 10 years?
Yes, I come from Science and Technology Studies as a professor at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, and I have a background in political science. And I've worked both in energy systems and more into mobility and transport. And one of my core interests has been how to engage people in the current and future energy transitions. So that's what I'm going to say a little bit more about. So first I want to highlight that the conceptualization of people's role in the energy transition has changed over time. So citizens has typically been understood as these passive technology recipients at the margins of rather centralized energy systems, and as these barriers to progress, either by failing to take up new technologies or by responding to technologies by this kind of selfish criticism, like we have seen, for instance, with wind farms. And people have been understood as consumers that are quite passively generating energy demand. And these conceptualizations are, of course, misleading and simplifications of people's potential engagement with energy and transport systems. And this is very problematic because the way citizens are perceived will eventually influence the way and the roles they are given in the energy transition. So if we go on to look at how participation is likely to be configured with different perceptions of people, we can see that this will be different if you look at people as self-centered, rational, economic decision-making individuals, or as environmentally more concerned, or as more collectively oriented towards more social beings. The point is that the ways in which people are imagined will have an effect, and the way policymakers, funding bodies, technology developers see people will allow for different kind of participation mechanisms. So if we look back again at the role that citizens have had in the previous era, we have moved away from this perception of people as typical knowledge deficit, and now we are into this area where people are seen more and more as democratic resources to be engaged in various ways more actively and have more active roles in the energy transition, for instance as prosumers. So at the same time we see that this has been a shift and a spread of strategies to institutionalize public engagement. And today the dominant focus is on citizen participation through this kind of dialogic processes. In addition, I would say, to seeing people as barriers, consumers, behavioral change, which is the kind of traditional way of viewing people. But we also see these new forms of participation that have become popular. It's been mentioned earlier, like co-design citizen science and open innovation. So there is some movement here. But to conclude, my point is that the framing of the people is still too narrow, and the role that publics have in the energy transition is too narrow. So we need to remake and reimagine how participation in science and technology development is done. And we have to see it more as open-ended processes and not as this particular events or decision moments where people are kind of brought in. It has to be seen as something that is going on across all areas of society and at all times. And just to finish, I will conclude by pointing towards this report that will be launched tomorrow as part of the Energy Shifts project, where we look more into recommendations on how to overcome these kind of shortcomings.
Super, thank you very much. Now, moving over to you, Imre, and don't forget also to introduce yourself in addition to setting out where you see the major challenges for the last 10 years in your field for citizens' engagement.
Thank you very much. So I work at the Free University of Brussels at the MOBI Research Center. I lead our research on urban mobility. And urban mobility, or mobility in general, is one of the disciplines where the engagement of users or citizens in general is quite essential, since we want to avoid building infrastructure or launching services that are not used by the potential target population, or they actually limit basic human rights, for example, accessibility or access to basic services. But I can also echo the previous speakers that there is still a lot to do. We've been talking about public participation in research and planning for several decades now, but we are still far from full participation. New methods have emerged, but what we see is that they are implemented very, very slowly. So I would only refer now to 3 of these new approaches, which also link to, each of them links to one of our projects, EU-funded projects we've been working on. So the first one is co-creation, as you also mentioned, or sometimes it's called the co-design. How can we involve people from the very beginning in the planning and research process when we still want to know what their problems are? What very often happens that we develop technologies which does not respond to the problems of the people. So first of all, we need to know what their problems are and then involve them to find solutions, evaluate these solutions, and also involve them in the implementation and the monitoring. Secondly, data has become a very important issue both in research and planning. And so far, we've been using citizens, passengers, as data sources, as subjects or objects of data collection. But how can we actually enable citizens to collect data themselves and organize campaigns, data collection campaigns that reflect their own problems in their neighborhoods, in their cities? Therefore, we are developing a platform that can enable citizens to develop online applications and then collaborate with fellow citizens who have smartphones, mobile phones, and collect data from their behavior or environment. And finally, it's not only citizens that are key, but also we need to involve the other stakeholders, the research community, the industry, policymakers, developers, and we need to develop a dialogue to have a common vision on how we want to see our transport system in the future. This is what we developed in the Mobility for EU project, and as a continuation to implement this vision and action plan, we have established, with the support of the European Commission, the European Transport and Mobility Forum, which is a dialogue platform to engage different types of stakeholders in user-centric design and co-creation. But I will talk about this later.
Thank you very much. That gives us a very complete snapshot of the current state of play. And now I'd like to delve into a little bit more detail in terms of some of your specific issues. And turning first of all to you, Chris. clearly you're involved with a lot of different Horizon 2020, as it currently is, funding projects. And you've got this specific specialist expertise in terms of the social science and humanities agenda. Now, which parts do you think have benefited most from that in terms of Horizon 2020? And what does it mean, actually, in terms of whether or not citizens are able to participate or not in the processes that you're engaged with?
Okay. Well, firstly, in terms of the whole social science, well, all of them together, how much funding do they get? So in terms of the energy research, the energy work program, so they started monitoring it in 2014, and there's a 2-year lag time, so they've just done one a few months ago for 2017, and in that they said that there was around 4% of all of the energy work program funding went to social science and humanities. Now, of course, it's never going to be as high as the STEM subjects, because of course the investment in infrastructure and the demonstrator projects of the technologies aren't there. But I think that is too low. And then you look within that 4%, so of that 4%, who's benefiting, as you ask? Well, across all of those four annual reports, economics and business management always win out. And I think lots of people in social science and humanities struggle with that, because economics and business management are contentious. Are they actually social science? Are they studying the organisation of society and how we act and why we do what we do? Are they actually just looking at businesses and how the economy is and assuming that's a proxy? So I think that's quite important, because then if that's the basis for then how citizens are engaged, then it's doing it on terms of reference of prioritising business and prioritising economics, which I think it's been shown for decades that that's not really how citizens participate in society. So that's what gets attention. And what doesn't get attention, I would probably point towards the humanities. And so of that 4%, only 1% of the funding goes to all of the humanities and the arts all together. And I think this fits with the research innovation agenda, where they're seeing social sciences and humanities as actually just social sciences. So they're engaging with citizens to try and understand how can we influence and affect and take them to where we're wanting to go, so with predefined agendas. Whereas I think the humanities, so philosophy, theology, history, would perhaps more fundamentally pose questions about the needs and wants of society and the directions of travel. So, and I think that gets missed. So when we're involving citizens, those questions are probably already decided. So actually, SSH for citizen engagement often just ends up being SS, and SS under the banner of economics and business management, I think.
Understood. Clearly, that's it's always useful to have the data at our fingertips. And in terms of the central role that social sciences and humanities has in driving citizen engagement, I think it's absolutely key in terms of the changes around behavioural change, for example, that will be connected to people understanding climate in a different way, from whether it's to do with the health benefits that they might have from the changes they can make in mobility and energy, all the way through to just an ease in urban living. So let's definitely come back to that in terms of recommendations of how we can then translate that into the future. Yep. Moving straight along to Imre. Question for you. No, sorry, not to Imre, to Robert. I apologise, to Robert. I could feel you were chomping at the bit there to get onto the recommendations side, so let's dig straight in. Again, you've also been involved in numerous different projects. So from some of your experiences, could you share with me a little bit around, and our audience here, around how you've been experimenting with different forms of civic engagement in research projects? And I think the interesting point here as well is the word experimentation. I mean, coming from Climate Kick, where it's all about innovation and experimentation, I'm very aware as well that some of the things you do when you experiment go wrong, and it's also quite interesting to learn from things that go wrong as well as go right. So in terms of experimenting, I would say don't hold back. Let's hear it all in terms of what can actually be learned from the experiences that you've had.
Yes. When you talk about citizen engagement, it all looks like politics. And I remember I was sitting in a meeting, steering committee of one of our projects, and there were the modeling guys. It was about transportation, autonomous mobility, and then I raised the issue that we should bring in some citizen engagement, and then the professor from the Technical University turns to me and says, well, Robert, what do you think, what kind of new knowledge can citizens bring to this project? And I think this is the basic attitude, and it is assumed that you just go out and ask people, and that's what it is. But actually, there are a lot of methods, and not only technology-driven like smartphones and that, but there are experiments with very specific methods, and we tried a few ones. We're working in one of our projects. We're doing social laboratories, social labs, which are a form of participatory action research, but it's engaging a wide variety of stakeholders to both define the social challenge that they want to address, but then also to experiment in pilots and then reflect on those pilots in their own lives and in their own projects. And then we do consensus conferences, which originated from the 60s in municipal planning, but then it became also a research tool when you, at certain points of your research, you go to your stakeholders, give them appropriate information that helps also to enable them and also to explain to them what actually you're doing, and then give them options, and they make the decision after debates, and then that decision you take onwards in your research. So not only the top-down researchers make the core decisions, but it is your stakeholders, and after serious debates based on a specific method. Also, we're experimenting with democratizing quadruple helix innovation, which Imre and his project kind of called, in which you not only have policymakers and innovators and researchers, but you also have the publics involved. And you try to create governance systems in which each of these groups' voices can be heard. And then there's participatory scenario building, which once again is a forecasting tool in which you methodologically and systematically involve stakeholders in designing the futures. All of this actually require a lot of effort on the researcher's side to talk a language, to make our research understandable to social actors, and then giving over some of our powers, also listening to the decisions that they make. So I think it's all about politics, but not necessarily the way policymakers understand, because it is our politics. We hand over certain powers of ours that we kind of try to stick to normally.
Thank you. And as just a rapid follow-up from that, are there any specific areas that you feel, from the experiences that you've witnessed, are there any specific things that you think can be scaled up to different areas? Because one of the issues around citizen engagement is it might be quite unique in some areas. What applies in one area doesn't necessarily always apply across to others. What could you recommend in terms of scaling up?
I think scaling up depends first on raising awareness. I think that this quote I gave you from an engineer is the state of play. So this is how they look at citizen or stakeholder engagement. I think that first we have to go out there and explain why this is beneficial for them, actually answering their question, what types of new knowledges can this bring to their research projects beyond their modeling exercise and beyond their traditional input-output models or their traditional methods that they're using, cost-benefit analysis and the others. I think that's what we have to show them, and that's what we're doing in these projects, trying to explain that there's a whole array of different knowledges out there that are relevant to our research. And it's not only the models that we should use. And I think that's, once they understand this, actually they're very enthusiastic to work with it. But this is not what is normally asked from them, because it's slower, It sometimes requires going out of the box thinking, and that's not the way research is normally done.
Okay, thank you. Now turning to you, Marianne, from your experience and the work that you've been undertaking, I'm interested to know a little more about the key challenges that you see around achieving a democratic transition that is actually inclusively engaging European citizens over the coming decade. Can you speak to that a little, please?
Yes. I think there is one thing that we tend to underestimate, and that's how the focus on accelerating the transition actually might put a setback to including publics in the energy transition. Like things we all agree on, I think, that things have to move faster. And as we have heard from the different examples here, we know that inclusion processes are time-consuming, and it's not that one moment kind of thing that you can tick off. It's an ongoing process that where you have to bring in a lot of different stakeholders. So in one way, it's easy to see that some people might say that, well, we don't have time to actually include people and to engage the publics because we really have to move forward in different areas. And there's another aspect to that as well, and which has to do with what public engagement actually can bring, and of course it also kind of can trigger resistance and contestation, which is something that, of course, we need to have that on the table in order to have inclusive engagement with technology development and the energy transition, but still it's something that can actually hamper the process. So I think it's kind of keeping an eye to those kind of contradicting processes are important when you talk about this.
Okay, thank you very much. And moving to you, Imre, from a mobility perspective, I had an interesting catch-up yesterday with my CEO, who's just come back from the summit in New York. She'd been at a WEF event, and she gave me an interesting statistic, which is that we're on track to go from 1.4 billion cars to 2.4 billion in the next 10 years. And even if they're all electric, we won't necessarily have space for them in our cities, and cities might well decide to think about starting to legislate cars out of cities, for example. So we're going to need to have effective, dramatically effective solutions that are going to be looking at concentrated use, for example, and significant opportunities for direct engagement and participation through shared ownership and redistribution might arise from some of this. And at the same time, clearly we're facing the beginning of a steep demographic curve with an aging population. And at the same time, on the other end of the scale, you have a increasingly carbon-conscious younger generation who maybe are considering abandoning cars. So bearing all that in mind, and from your experience with your projects, how can we enable a dialogue between researchers and the developers and the policymakers that several other speakers have also referred to, in order to mainstream this idea of a user-centric approach in the planning and design of a future transport system?
As you said, really dramatic changes are needed in our transport systems to avoid these scenarios where we might have beautiful electric and automated vehicles, but still 6, 10-lane motorways cutting through our cities. And this can only be implemented through a cooperation between research. And the key here is for research to show what the impact of our current behavior would be and what alternatives we have. And there, user engagement and involvement is really key, because this is how the people, the citizens, the passengers can learn how they can contribute to this change. Because the key issue in reaching a carbon neutral society is changing behavior and changing habits of the people. That is the key challenge. And then we have policy, but we need to be careful with policy, because if there is no acceptance of this policy, and we live in a democratic society, if people would not accept a new tax or a congestion charge, then we can move on very, very slowly. So as I said earlier, we really need a dialogue between researchers, policymakers, citizens, and users. And that's why we actually created this European Transport and Mobility Forum, to stop thinking in silos and bring all these people together to have a dialogue and develop a user-centric transport system, which is based on the ideas of universal design, affordability, and providing accessibility to all citizens. Of course, it's not easy, and we have experienced quite a few setbacks, because then you have people which we call hard-to-reach groups, but are they really hard to reach? They are hard to reach from the perspective of researchers or policy, but they might say that researchers and policy is hard to reach for themselves. These are people who might not be using online tools, might not have smartphones or internet subscriptions, or might not be engaged in public activities. But also, when we say that we involve stakeholder groups and stakeholders, and how can we avoid that we always get the usual suspects, the very engaged citizens, the very engaged cyclists, the very engaged car drivers, but always the smaller, well-educated, middle-class groups in the participation process. But also for the other stakeholder groups, how can we avoid that it's only the representatives of big European umbrella organizations who participate in creating, let's say, a vision or an action plan for transport in Europe? So these are all challenges, and that goes back to what Robert was saying, that we need quite a bit of effort. There is no easy way to go for participation, and it requires time, money, effort, and engagement, and, as you said, out-of-box thinking.
Fascinating, thank you. That tallies very well with some projects that we're just starting around reaching out to different types of user groups, and that includes football supporters, for example. So really quite a different, they're not the ones that you would normally find in the sort of closed bubble, particularly in Brussels. So moving now to the open part of the discussion. I'm not sure if we have one of the fancy dice that I've seen in some of the other sessions, whether or not we need to pass the microphone, but I think it might be that I have to pass the microphone. Is there a microphone at the back? Has anybody got, so I'm sure somebody has got a question. So please stand with your question, introduce yourself, and keep it fairly brief, and maybe let which panelist know that you're addressing it to. Do I see any questions? Don't be shy. Your moment to co-design.
We said it all.
They must have said something that... There we are. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. My name is Giulia Venturini. I work for an aviation industry. My question is, as I come from industry, our driver in R&D, of course, is business. So we have to have an economic added value. And I would like to ask you how to introduce the added value of SSH while you are doing R&D in STEMs. Because I am surrounded by 450 engineers. I am the only one who is not engineer in my team. And sometimes I feel alone because we do not know how to bring the added value when you have to deliver products and affordable products for our customers. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris, is that one for you?
Sure. Yeah, I can start it at least. Yeah, this is something I suppose that we've done quite a lot in the energy side of things, where we've engaged with industry network associations for different types of solar PV or whatever type of industry energy clean technology, and this is something that often we have to begin our pitch with, and well, obviously it depends upon each situation, but often what we tend to come back to are even just in terms of expectation management. So, I mean, this is probably more of the user-focused side, but obviously I think it's quite easy to demonstrate very quickly that SSH can give you a window into unintended consequences, how something that may have been imagined by the designer or by the industry behind an intervention tends to have all of these ripple effects in different areas. So it's, you're doing it for one target citizen, one target user, and actually it perhaps affects them in ways that you never really thought about. You don't know that until you work with them, but it also will affect all these other people in different ways. So I mean, that's something that we often latch onto. And also, I think if you start going down that idea of impact assessment, which I think is a bit more comfortable within those sorts of sectors, and you start to broaden it out, I think you can sort of cleverly start to force in some of the humanities questions around actually what is success, what are impacts, what are our boundaries for what we're wanting to assess this on. And if you're and to really answer that question well, I think you need to involve citizens in sort of setting the terms of reference for that, rather than, for instance, the industry or the business saying, well, actually this is the success. I know it's difficult when obviously you have your own internal key performance indicators, which are then driven by often economic growth, which then needs technological innovation, and then this is where they start to hit. But at least that's sort of one way in which we start to get a foot in the door.
Were there any other panelists who would like to respond? Yes.
Yeah. Yes. I think that somehow technology and business is entangled in our imaginary, but it's not necessarily so. And it's, you can be reminded of Nokia. Actually, Nokia had wonderful engineers, except that Steve Jobs had a vision, and it wasn't a technological vision, it was a design vision. He wanted to make things simple and beautiful. And I think both simplicity and beauty are SSH phenomena, if I want to translate it to academic discourse. And I think if you want to bring it down to everyday life, then I'm a philosopher of technology. I can give a lot of reasoning to risks. And risks are part of business. And a psychologist could bring a lot of information about human behavior. That is also business. And an artist can bring in a lot of design and beauty aspects, which is also business. So I think that it is not necessarily so that business should be all about tech. Actually, just the opposite. I think SSH, if we translate it to these practical things, then can bring a lot of knowledge into the business area of technology development.
Yes, please, Marie.
And I think social sciences can also open up new business opportunities if you only think of the aging population that was already mentioned, or the consciousness of sustainability and carbon neutrality. These are all coming from the research perspective. Once in social sciences we can prove and forecast that in 20 years' time there will be this many people over the age of 60, and they will need accessible vehicles, accessible platforms, user-centric design that can now help already business to actually design products that will cater for these new markets.
Are there any other questions from the audience before we move on? Okay, so I would like us to now move on. We've looked state of play, we've looked into a little bit of depth in your respective areas. In terms of concluding remarks around your concrete recommendations on how to engage citizens better in Europe, I would like to maybe start with you, Marianne, if that's okay.
Yeah. Well, I think for the EU, it's important to assess how we institutionalize the funding and the strategies that acquire distinctive discursive practices and competence and skills. so that you don't exclude certain types of SSH perspectives, for instance, or particular groups participating. I also think that to open up, as I said, the decision-making processes and the kind of make this continuous dialogue is some of the ways that you should be going into. Yes, I think that's the starting point, at least.
Okay, and turning to you, Robert, same question in terms of your concrete recommendations on how to engage citizens better in Horizon Europe. And also, I mean, as it's currently set up, is it set up in a way that, do you think, does encourage citizen involvement?
Well, you guess, not very much. And I would like to make a meta recommendation and then a shop floor recommendation. Meta level, I think that Europe has its own approach to research and innovation, and I think the cornerstones of that unique approach is inclusivity, democracy, and equitability. And I think that's what research and innovation in Europe and for Europe must look at. And how to do that, I think it's all about policy integration. It's not about big things, it's about small things. Small things, you have to engage your researchers through their templates that they have to fill in when they apply for research and innovation funding. It has to be part of the evaluation process. Each and every research and innovation process has to be evaluated on the basis of citizen engagement, SSH integration also. As long as these things are not part of the evaluation, it will never happen. So if Mr. Moedas or the new commissioner wants to make this happen, first and foremost, it has to go into evaluation processes. And then, obviously, researchers don't know how to do it. You have to offer expertise, assistance in how to do it. And it's all out there. There's Chris. There's all these people around here who can offer their expertise how to do it. And I think the European Research Network should go out of its way to offer such expertise, and the investments that have been made through the SWAFS program line since FP6, 7, and 8 is out there. It has to be just spread across the board. So these are very specific things that the European policymakers have to do, and however much talk there is out there, until these things are not happening, we won't believe them that they mean it seriously, sorry to say.
Okay, well, they are in the room, I have to say, as well.
So I hope.
I'm sure they're listening. Marion, I think you had a quick follow-up.
Yeah, I just have a follow-up on that. And I think, adding to that, I think it's important to look at the quality and how assessments are monitored then. It's not about counting the number of people reached necessarily, but it's about finding new ways to monitor and finding new indicators on how to engage people in a good way. So it's more about quality than quantity.
Couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Imre, same question to you in terms of your final recommendations that you'd like to leave the Commission with today.
Yeah, I would like to link to this idea of improving quality rather than quantity, and I think we need three things for that. To develop and mainstream practical tools that can help the engagement of citizens, both online but also offline tools. Then we need the appropriate time and funding reflected also in the work programs and in the projects, acknowledging that engaging citizens takes time and takes effort. And finally, I think we need flexibility in the projects because if you work with citizens, if you work with social sciences, you cannot predict for a 3-year project for each month what you are going to do and how you are going to go about it. It's not software development or engineering. And very often what we see is that we need to stick to the letter of the grant agreement. There is no flexibility, while when you work with citizens, new ideas, new research avenues might come up, and then we are not able to actually reflect to those.
Thank you. And Chris?
Yeah, great. I think everyone's sort of stealing a bit of my thunder because I'm agreeing with everything that's being said.
Don't be boring.
I'll try and extend a few things. I suppose, I mean, as Robert was implying, I would similarly prioritise with my recommendations structural ways through how the Commission manages its research and innovation program. Can you still hear me? Okay. Yeah, great. To make sure that the opportunities are there for those who have the citizen engagement expertise, because as far as I can see, the opportunities and the way things are structured favour those that either don't have the expertise but think they perhaps can do it through just giving it a go, or only prioritise certain parts of it. So some examples that I'd probably tangibly give, beyond what I've sort of been implying in terms of utilising the humanities more and not just sort of doing economics research under a banner of social science and humanities, is exactly in terms of the evaluation process. So making sure that those on the evaluation panel, there is an SSH expert on every panel, and that there's actually sensitivity to their expertise. So if citizen engagement is important, making sure that actually there's a person reviewing it who can understand the nuances of the argument. In terms of even something as simple as the proposal template that will no doubt be drawn up soon, that everyone will be following for Horizon Europe. Obviously, how the Horizon 2021 was done, it's sort of locked in a way to how then the things were evaluated, how everyone was approached. And I think it would be really good to make clear that cross-cutting SSH priorities such as citizen engagement can and should be put in the concept part, section 1, up front. It shouldn't just be put in the impacts or the pathways to impact, or even worse, just the comms part of the impact. It's actually something that should be front and center and as part of the whole conceptual approach, like, as I said earlier, like step 0, like the planning part. And then also just finally to echo what Marianne said around the monitoring. I think, it's great to have this, but then it needs to be followed up. And this year, the Commission have started monitoring quality of SSH integration for the first time, but it does exist around counts. Obviously, it's just the first part of the journey. Alongside that, they do have sort of case studies of best practice projects, and I would personally suggest that those case studies were scaled up in sort of more in terms of a sort of a qualitative interrogation. So not just the Commission's view of their experience, but actually going in and seeing what worked, what didn't, and also learning from how these structures of the proposal locked them into certain ways to then plan for the latter part of Horizon Europe, and then who knows what comes after that.
Thank you very much. Now, we've been incredibly efficient, and I'm wondering if that extra round there of recommendations has maybe stimulated some more questions from the floor. So I'm going to throw it back to you, including Commission reps, if there's any other questions that you would like to put to the panel, or if indeed there are any specific comments you'd like to recommend from your own points of view as well, in terms of how we can better engage citizens in Horizon Europe. Thank you at the back.
I'm Ivo Grey from Polis. We're a network of cities and regions. I want to say that I find it remarkable that there is no end-user representative in the panel. I don't know if that's a choice or by default. I have the remark that we are engaged in a lot of research where we start from the cities as an interface with citizens. In our area, urban mobility, that's a field where the citizen and the user of mobility services is key, and all the research we do has a strong involvement of citizens. So I think there are pockets, let's say, in Horizon 2020 where there are really good experiences that can be shared, that can be also used as cases for further uptake. It's more a comment than a question. Sorry.
And thank you for the comment. Any other comments or questions? Thank you.
Good morning, Rafał Stanecki, European Commission, DG Move. I'm here listening on citizens' involvement on social sciences, But I would like to ask you, in the area of energy and transport, which is also on the screen, any particular comments that that you could make for this, to achieve this clean and affordable energy and transport? Thank you.
Yes, ban cars. So simple it is. I think, and this is kind of the debate that we're having, and this is what you alluded to, that there is a technology perspective of mobility, which is always around which is car-centered, and when my field, autonomous mobility, is talking about, people talk about autonomous mobility, but they mean autonomous cars. And I think that's where the policymakers can come in and obviously slowly phase out cars. And I think that's the solution. It's very simple. And then again, if you do proper citizen engagement, this is what they'll tell you, that cars are a problem. Cars are dangerous. I'm a father of two. The biggest fear I have is that my children get killed on the road. And that's what a citizen's perspective can bring to technology development. And I think that's what needs to be channeled into policymaking. And cars are the most violent technosocial system. And it's not natural that they're violent because, and in Europe, 25,000 people die on the road every year. Globally, almost more than 2 million. And when we think of mobility, we kind of accept this violence. But it's not necessarily so if you think of elevators. Elevators have been becoming widespread the moment when they were not dangerous. And the Boeing 800s were grounded the moment when violence was part of their operation. So I think there is a lot to do, but you have to be bold.
Everyone's waking up. So I've got, I think, every member of the panel wanting to respond as well, but let me just have a quick look and see if there were other questions as well in the room. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, Nathan Patterson from 4Atom, a trade association based in Brussels here. So I have a comment based on what was just said there, but it will also turn into a little bit of a question. And it's really about well, agreeing with the member on the panel and reflecting that it comes down to risk that citizens would accept. So the question is really about, do you think there's more that could get done about working with citizens so they understand the risk of doing a certain action or not? Because when it comes to automated vehicles, I agree there should be a movement towards that. But if there's 1 or 2 deaths due to a certain thing, people will say, wait a minute, let's not do that. There'll be a sensationalism that will come with it. And people won't realise that 25,000 people die per year in normal deaths. Is there more engagement in the risk perception to help push forward projects? So risk engagement with citizens, I suppose. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Who would like to take, Marianne?
I would like to respond indirectly to your answer, actually. And I think from an SSH perspective, I think it's important to keep in mind that there is no solution for everything, that we should actually take cultural, national diversity into consideration when we talk about solutions. So yes, banning cars, for instance, are solutions in some places where you have attractive solutions, and that's also part of what you have to do, is to make what are the attractive solutions visible. Like a walkable city is clearly a much more attractive city to live in than a car-centric city. Again, if you live in Norway like I do, electric cars is kind of the answer to a lot of low carbon. It's a low carbon solution that works well in scarcely populated areas. So I think that's also something that we should keep in mind.
Thank you. Chris, I think you wanted to also come in there.
Thanks, yeah. Yeah, I'd almost have a comment for all of those questions, but maybe I'll attempt to just bring it back to I think the unique thing that social sciences and humanities can do for us, which hasn't happened enough, is instead of focusing on technological, say, risks or advances, which really put the focus on efficiency or fuel switching, as was said about, whether it's tongue-in-cheek or not, stop cars, actually the point there is that it's sort of like a social innovation. It's conservation. It's changing what we do in terms of how we operate as society, rather than trying to keep what we're doing as society the same or continue escalating it. Actually, it's about bigger questions around how comfortable are we? How could we practically change the way we live in the way that we urgently need to meet these challenges, and then bringing it full circle back to the point that was made about the cities. I think this is the sort of thing that is exactly the case of why we need to engage cities, and cities are a really unique clustering of communities all thrown in the same sort of energy-intensive space, and we've done workshops with stakeholders to exactly do those sorts of things, sort of bottom-up visions, I think, and that should be done more, I think.
And over to you for the final response.
Yes, I do agree. Let's ban cars. Let's create a beautiful walking environment. But at the same time, we need to move beyond the silos of transport planning and the other disciplines, because we might have beautiful walking environments, but if people have to work 50, 100 kilometers from where they live in office parks with bad accessibility of public transport, then we need to move to other disciplines such as urban planning, spatial planning, which have to be integrated with transport planning, engineering, and so on to really achieve this goal.
Thank you. And one sentence, literally, because we're going to get kicked out.
Well, there are two things to qualify what banning cars is. We have to understand what cars are. We don't. And the second is that our cities and our environments didn't become like that without cars. Cars made them as they are. So if we change our mobility structures, our cities will also change. There's nothing pre-given.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to conclude the session. It's clear that citizen engagement is not just a question of economic participation, and it's especially in the next decade with concerns around halting climate change mounting. We're also going to be looking at the purpose and the meaning around rethinking what mobility services and energy services are and what they need and get in terms of future Horizon Europe engagement. So thanks once again for attending, and thank you to all of the panellists today.
Thank you.